By the time 1993 arrived, Sonic the Hedgehog had been firmly established in the consciousness of the video game industry. He had been born out of Sega's desire to overtake Nintendo as the world's leading console manufacturer, and in many ways he succeeded at this goal. As the series went on and received more games though, it would begin to evolve into so much more than just an answer to the famed Italian plumber. Sonic had a world that was more grounded, albeit still fantastical enough to draw in the attention of those who saw him, a cool cast of characters to go along with said world and give it life, and a fascinating depth of mechanics that produced an almost unmatched sense of replayability and mastery. Essentially, there really wasn't anything else like Sonic, and while basically every company would start to make their own attitude-ridden platforming mascots as a means of capturing a piece of that pie, all were overshadowed by the blue blur and didn't stand a chance. That being said, things were not all sunshine and rainbows behind the scenes. Nobody really knew it at the time, but the people behind Sonic were beginning to struggle quite a bit. It all started with the development of Sonic 2, which I went into in my recent video on the game. Long story short, it was heavily rushed to release for the 1992 holiday season, and the development was plagued by an infighting among the Japanese and American developers, including producer Mark Cerny, who eventually left the project altogether when it was nearing completion. It was also around this time where Sega would stop making good business decisions, and invested too much time and money into experimental add-ons for the Genesis. They couldn't have picked a worse time to do so either, as by this point the SNES was starting to catch up with the Genesis' sales, due in large part to a similarly aggressive marketing campaign Nintendo had made in retaliation to the infamous Sega does what Nintendo don't. It became clear to Sega that they needed one last Sonic game for their platform, and had to make it the biggest, most ambitious one yet. However, development on this game would, just like Sonic 2, be plagued with issues. It was once again handled by a California-based Sega Technical Institute, rather than Oshima's team that had worked on Sonic CD. The team felt that they needed to leave an impact with this game, and so the scope of the project quickly began to expand. Levels would be triple the size of those in Sonic 2, and there would be more of them to boot. There would be different music tracks for each individual act, and the story would be made much deeper than previous entries as a way to expand Sonic's world. Initially, it was intended to be an isometric game similar to Sonic 3D Blast, except it would use an all-new graphics chip to render real polygonal visuals. Oddly enough, this is strikingly familiar to the original plans for Super Mario Bros. 3, which Nintendo also wanted to be isometric at first. Isn't that weird? Anyway, this ended up being scrapped for a more conventional side-scroller. Thankfully, once it became clear the chip wouldn't be finished before the 1994 deadline. Because, and I swear I'm not making this up, Sega had set a deadline for the project in January 1994 due to a partnership with McDonald's to promote the game. Yes, I'm serious. Go and look it up for yourself. This is real. In addition to that, Sega employed outside help for the music, partnering with Brad Buxer, as well as a little-known artist you might have heard of, named Michael Jackson. You know, kind of an obscure musician, doubt you've heard. Regardless, Sonic 3 would suffer development troubles, as I was saying. The sheer scope of the game, as well as the high cost of manufacturing 34 megabit cartridges to store it, made it clear to the developers that it wouldn't be fully completed in time for the January deadline. What certainly didn't help was the animosity between some team members, particularly with Yuji Naka's harsh leadership that once again reared its ugly head. All attempts to get more development time were denied by Sega, who were committed to that McDonald's partnership. Reluctantly, the developers made the decision to split the game in two halves, which would buy more time to finish the rest of the game, while still giving Sega something to release that year. The second part of the game, Sonic and Knuckles, would be sold standalone as well, but with a twist. Its cartridge would be unique, given its own cart slot on the top, referred to in the marketing as lock-on technology. In reality, it was just a specialized circuit that linked multiple ROMs to one memory address space. In layman's terms, both games were loaded at once, and with a little bit of hardware magic, combined to form the large, ambitious title that was intended from the start. The full game was referred to as Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and my oh my what a beaut it is. It stands out from the rest of the Genesis library, which to me only makes it all the more special. A bit of a superficial aspect for sure, but still. For simplicity's sake though, I'll be referring to it as either Sonic 3 and K or just Sonic 3 throughout this video, and will rarely mention the standalone versions. If I do, I'll point it out, but heads up, if you hear me say Sonic 3, in most cases you can assume I'm talking about the full combined game and not just its first half. In any case, Sonic 3 and K would be released in its two halves throughout 1994. The first part, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, came out in February, and the second, Sonic and Knuckles, in October. A combined version called Sonic the Hedgehog 3 Limited Edition, which would have been Sonic 3 and K to one cartridge, was planned, but eventually scrapped. While the game received widespread critical acclaim, with many publications naming it the best Sonic game to date, it would go on to sell significantly fewer copies than the previous games. It still topped out at a respectable 4 million units, but when you consider the 7.55 million of Sonic 2 and the 15 million of Sonic 1, that number doesn't seem very large anymore. Worse for Sega still, Nintendo had really gone hard with the SNES in 1994, including the release of Rareware's Donkey Kong Country, which used state-of-the-art pre-rendered graphics, producing a far more detailed look that allowed it to ship 9.3 million copies. It was in this year that Nintendo's 16-bit machine finally finally overtook Sega's, once again allowing them to claim the majority of the market share in the end. Sega was in serious trouble, not helped by the fact that they kept making poor decisions, including the release of another Genesis add-on, the 32X. Consumers saw the company as desperate and were rapidly losing faith in them, which caused many to go for an SNES instead, as none of its exciting new games required expensive extra hardware to play. Despite all this, however, that wouldn't stop Sonic 3 and Knuckles from being remembered fondly. To this day, it's considered one of the best Sonic games ever made, if not the best. While some people still prefer Sonic 2, and a few Sonic 1 or even Sonic CD, chances are if you ask someone what the pinnacle of this series is, they'll cite Sonic 3 and K. It's a beloved classic, and is often in the conversation for the greatest side-scrolling platformer ever made. I've made it no secret by now, but I share this enthusiasm for Sonic 3. My god, does it feel good to finally be able to say that without dancing around it. You won't believe how hard it was to go the last few videos without mentioning it in some capacity. I even let it slip out on occasion, just a bit. But yeah, I'm one of those people who considers this game the pinnacle of 2D Sonic. I first played it back in 2018, shortly after Sonic 1, and I actually told a bit of a fib in my Sonic 2 video and made it seem like I played that game before 3 and K, but the opposite was actually true. When I originally got my Genesis along with a lot of games for $65 with the hilariously broken powers of the Facebook Marketplace, it came with Sonic 1 and 2, but not Sonic 3. A bit of a bummer, since Sonic 3 was actually the game I really wanted to play out of them all after hearing about its extremely positive legacy, but no big deal. I bought both halves for a total of $30, a bit steep, but that's how things are sometimes, you know. And as soon as they arrived, I got right into the game. Admittedly, I did have some trouble beating it my first time around, struggling with some aspects, but that was also true for most other retro platformers, including the previous Sonic games. Once I did manage to conquer it though, I was on top of the world. With more playthroughs, I would begin to get better at the game, and through it all I declared it the best Sonic game I had played up to that point. That would continue up until I got to experience a certain other game in the series, but that's a story for another day. With that said though, I still hold a lot of respect for Sonic 3 to this day. You know, 5 years after I originally played it, I am scared. Existential crisis due to our inevitably approaching demise aside, I love this game, and for a plethora of reasons. I think the developers succeeded at making it the biggest and most ambitious in the series when it released, while still managing to keep the same level of polish that had been set in stone by the series since its inception, in spite of its rushed development. This is a video I've been really eager to work on since the start of this retrospective, and the day's finally come. So sit back, get something to munch on, and enjoy. As soon as you turn that power on, it becomes clear the developers set out to make a fantastic first impression. It may seem silly to bring that up after 3 other games where they did essentially the same damn thing, but in the case of Sonic 3, I get this feeling the most. A pre-rendered sprite of Sonic, which has way more detail than any of the other title screen appearances, jumps toward the screen, making way for yet another flashy logo and island background, really enticing you to press start. I love it when you can tell a game had effort poured into it from the offset, and Sonic 3 is no exception. Alright, enough delay. What's Sonic gotten himself into this time around? Well, this game has a surprisingly complex plot for a 2D platformer, containing way more detail than those that came before. I have a fair bit to discuss in comparison to the previous videos, so please bear with me here. It actually picks up shortly after Sonic 2, or as is otherwise known, the West Island incident. Sonic and Tails have successfully knocked the Death Egg out of space, defeating Eggman once again in the process. The space station ends up falling from the sky, crash landing on a mysterious floating landmass known as Angel Island. The force from the impact causes it to fall into the ocean below, which catches the attention of one of its few inhabitants, its guardian, a red echidna named Knuckles. The crash knocks him unconscious, and in the meantime, Eggman detects an energy signature from a very large emerald deep within the island. Figuring he could use its power to relaunch the Death Egg, he constructs a base on the island and starts converting its wildlife into badniks, as he always does. When Knuckles regains consciousness, he finds the altar damaged, and notices how the island has fallen into the sea. After a bit of exploring, he finds the Death Egg stranded in a lake, and instantly thinks it's a legendary dragon that's come to bring death and destruction to the island, as foretold by a mural in its ancient temples. Eventually, he comes across Eggman, and once the doctor learns that Knuckles is the guardian of this place, he pretends to be a good doctor who's come to inspect the large piece of debris that crashed into the island. He warns Knuckles of an evil blue hedgehog and orange two-tailed fox who were apparently following him and getting in the way of his research, and that they would arrive on Angel Island and cause similar trouble. Being gullible, Knuckles falls for this scheme and prepares for their arrival, completely unaware that he's been tricked and Eggman is secretly planning to steal the item that produced the energy signal, a large gemstone called the Master Emerald, which keeps the inhabitants of the island safe, and use it for his own purposes. Meanwhile, on another faraway island, Tails detects the same huge emerald signature that Eggman had. Wondering if this is connected to the recent tsunami that, unbeknownst to him, had been caused by Angel Island falling, he asks Sonic about it. Having found a ring with ancient letters inscribed on it, Sonic remembers the tale of a floating island, which had previously been created after a large swath of land drifted off from a continent. A rogue sect of an ancient tribe on the island had lusted for power granted by the mystical gemstones, those of course being the Chaos Emeralds, and so turned on the others, which had caused the tribe's downfall. Soon after, the gods had apparently granted the island the ability to float with the Master Emerald, entrusting a guardian to ensure the island was safe. Sensing another adventure coming on, Sonic and Tails set off on the tornado in search of the island. After only a little bit of searching, the two heroes come across the island and see the crashed Death Egg on it. Knowing Eggman must be up to something, Sonic goes in, powering up with the Chaos Emeralds. But as soon as he makes it inland, Knuckles ambushes him and manages to steal the emeralds. Knowing this was the Hedgehog Eggman had lied to him about, he tries everything he can to halt his progress and prevent him from meddling with the Doctor's plans. Tails comes in, having landed the tornado in a safe spot, and Sonic tells him about what happened. The stage is now set for their next adventure, and they'll have to travel across Angel Island in search of the emeralds, all the while doing what they can to stop Eggman from relaunching the Death Egg and taking over the world. So yeah, that was quite a lot more than the previous entries in the series, now wasn't it? I really like that they did this. One of the Sonic series' strongest facets was always its world and cast of characters, things I've been praising the franchise for since the start, and Sonic 3 for sure is one of the most interesting in this regard so far. For one, I love the setting they went with. Sure, maybe the whole island motif is starting to get a little bit stale, and fortunately Sega acknowledged this. As such, Angel Island was made to be a hovering landmass, which makes it stand out from the crowd, which were more or less standard islands minus the drifting aspect of South Island. I've always found floating landmasses to be one of the coolest possible settings for, well, anything really, and Angel Island certainly doesn't disappoint. What makes it so much cooler is how the game fleshes out the setting. In the previous games, when you cleared a zone, Sonic would just appear in the next one after a brief fade out. In Sonic 3, on the other hand, each zone features a quick transitional cutscene, making it so each one logically flows into the next. Sure, in many cases the zones aren't directly connected, but even when they aren't, the fact there's any context provided makes it feel so much more like a real living world. Fantastical setting notwithstanding. Even something as simple as Knuckles pressing a button to drop Sonic into a pit below, or seeing the flying battery float in above Mushroom Hill, are really neat to see and greatly enhance the game's world building. Also, the transitions between individual acts within the same zone take a page from the Half-Life series, featuring clever use of interiors and backgrounds to make the transition between the two seamless. These changes may seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, since really they don't affect gameplay, but I'd say that doesn't mean such details have no value. It makes the game way cooler, making it feel more complete and, as I said, more like a living, breathing world rather than a series of random disconnected levels. Sure, it's a Genesis game, so you aren't going to get the same level of interconnectedness that games on more powerful hardware are able to pull off, but as far as a 16-bit platformer goes, this is about as good as it gets. And that's only the game's setting. There's still so much more that it does to enhance the plot and presentation this time around. Sonic games had already had some brief story moments throughout to provide some surface level context, but never to the extent that Sonic 3 does. I already mentioned the zone transitions, but on top of that, there's even a few brief cutscenes in various points throughout the game. Many of these involve Knuckles using his knowledge of the island's layout to his advantage, impeding Sonic's progress using secret switches or machinery located at key spots. My favorite of these is definitely the one near the beginning of Mushroom Hill Act 2, where Knuckles maniacally laughs while flipping the switch back and forth. Puts a smile on my face whenever I see it. Others, such as the fall of the Death Egg after Launch Base Zone, are plainly cool to look at, and later on in the game there's a lot of this stuff leading up to the climax. I'll get into that later though when it becomes relevant. All in all, this extra effort goes a long way. It makes the game feel more like an experience rather than gameplay with a story in the background, if that makes any sense. Sure, Sonic has always had a little more than is typical for this genre in this respect, but this game is on another level. And no, I'm not saying it's the most mind-blowing thing in the world, but it is nonetheless really cool for a game this old. Also, I absolutely love the character of Knuckles the Echidna. Continuing on with the series pattern, he's the new character this game brings to the table, and definitely one of my favorite members of Sonic's extended cast. He's a hot-headed echidna, an animal that's pretty much a hedgehog and anteater combined, who's very gullible and doesn't think things through, as evidenced by him trusting Eggman despite his suspect nature. The game makes him seem malicious with how often he gets in Sonic's way, and as a result, he takes on the role of Sonic's rival, or at least the first one that wasn't a robotic version of the Hedgehog anyway. In reality though, he's just very dedicated to his job of protecting the Master Emerald and by extension the island, and so he's very aggressive towards any potential threat to its safety. I'd imagine the Death Egg's crash had already put the guy on edge, further exacerbating this. While his backstory wouldn't really be explored until future entries, I find what is there in Sonic 3 really captivating, and above all else, entertaining. Knuckles isn't quite Dr. Eggman in this regard, but it's still really fun to watch his antics antics and all the various traps he has for intruders. Also, later in the game, he goes through a satisfying arc, but again, I'll come back to that when it becomes relevant. Jesus Christ, man, this video is already going on how long now, and I haven't even touched on the mechanics one bit. I guess there's just that much to talk about. So how about we shift gears for a bit and get into the things this game adds in terms of actual gameplay. If you ask me, I think this game refines the already great Sonic gameplay to absolute perfection. Or well, about as close to perfection as it can get. Much like Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal, many of the changes and additions aren't exactly revolutionary and may come off as minor to some, but their combined impacts add up and make the game so much more refined than its predecessors. For starters, the controls and physics once again function exactly as they did in Sonic 2. No more bizarro Sonic CD spin dash, no more weird jank, it's all back to being as smooth as before. That's good, because I thought the control and physics were about as good as they could be in Sonic 2. There is one minor thing in how Sonic will sometimes get stopped if he travels up a vertical slope too quickly, and in some cases he may even clip and get stuck out of bounds. Funnily enough, these minor bugs were called Eggman's diabolical traps in the original manual, and they say the only way to get out of it is to reset the game. Or you could wait 10 minutes for time to run out, I suppose. Nevertheless, I find that these glitches don't happen particularly often, and so they don't get on my nerves at all. Sonic 3 is a very smooth game from start to finish, and controlling it is very responsive. In addition to bringing us back to Sonic 2's superior controls, Sonic 3 also adds a couple of new elements to Sonic's moveset, all of which I find are for the best. So remember how the previous games had this one shield power-up that protected you for an extra hit? Well, Sonic 3 fleshes out that idea, being the first Sonic game to truly experiment with multiple power-ups. They take the form of the elemental shields, of which there's 3. The bubble shield is the most basic. It allows Sonic to breathe underwater, meaning you won't have to rely on sparse air bubbles to survive under the waves. That's good because holy hell the first half of the game sure does love water. I think every single level, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, has at least one part with a pool of it somewhere. Additionally, this shield lets Sonic bounce, acting as a sort of prototype bounce bracelet. So that's cool, but to be honest, I've never really found this ability that useful in this game. Meanwhile, I've gotten tons of use out of the other 2. The flame shield, as expected, makes Sonic immune to fiery hazards such as, well, fire, it starts there, but also magma, which is quite handy because of how often bosses have fire-based attacks. On top of this, the shield also lets you do an air dash, a really sick ability that makes you feel like a badass when you pull it off, which also acts as a prototype homing attack. Noticing a pattern? However, with all that said, my favorite one has to be the Thunder Shield. If you're familiar with its implementation in later games, you know it attracts rings towards Sonic, but in this game, there's one more ability that makes it supremely badass. Its special ability allows Sonic to do a double jump, which I don't think needs explanation as to why it's so good. That being said, it doesn't completely break the platforming, but rather simply provides an advantage. Remember, taking a hit will cause you to lose these shields, so you have to be careful not to take damage if you want to use their abilities. In the case of the Flame and Thunder shields, stepping into water will also cause Sonic to lose them, and with how frequently water appears in this game, maintaining the shields is not always a walk in the park. You also won't need them to beat the game, and everything is perfectly doable with Sonic's base moveset. This is particularly true because of something else the game adds. It's a brand new move for Sonic's base moveset, not requiring any power-ups or whatnot to do. While Sonic is in mid-air after a jump, pressing the button again will cause a Thunder Shield-like aura to materialize around him for a split second, along with a noise that sounds like an electric shock. This is the Insta-Shield, and oh man is it a useful ability. Admittedly, I wouldn't call it this game changer that radically alters how you play, but with how handy of an ability it is, I'm all for its inclusion. Its main purpose is to briefly protect yourself from damage. If timed properly, you can typically pass through enemy attacks no problem. What I find it most useful for though is getting easier hits on bosses or enemies. When you perform an Insta-Shield, Sonic's hitbox also briefly extends, which lets you hit things that are just barely out of reach. In addition, it's an effective method of landing safer hits on enemies, as you can often take them out before Sonic even has a chance to touch them. I find that this is at its most useful during boss fights, which, by the way, I think the bosses in this game are the best they've been yet. They're still not very challenging, but they at least rely on far more interesting ideas for their attacks. That's good because each individual act now has a boss. Act 1 has a mini-boss, and Act 2 the typical face-off against Eggman. Maybe the new approach to bosses doesn't add a whole ton, but it's new content that spices up each stage, making each act more identifiable, I suppose. At any rate, when you're fighting one, you can quickly land several hits by properly timing your uses of the Insta-Shield. Using it also tends to cause Sonic to rebound, which in many cases can get you out of the way of a boss's attacks before they can hit you, or even be helpful in lining up your next attack. This move is satisfying as hell to pull off, and it's hard not to feel like a gaming guru when you drain a boss's health in rapid succession. I could go on and on about the times I used this attack throughout the game, but we'd be here all day, and quite frankly, this video is already almost as long as the previous ones, and is continuing to grow. But trust me, I'm not even close to being done with this game. I have so much more to talk about. Like for instance, the improved difficulty balancing. While I don't find Sonic 1 and 2 to be particularly hard games, they could nonetheless be very punishing for newcomers due to a variety of factors. For one, getting used to the physics-based platforming could prove a challenge for some, and when combined with the screen crunch problems, limited continues, and the lack of a password or save system, those games could be quite unforgiving for newbies. Sonic 2 in particular suffered from this particular effect. While I thought it was a lot more refined in the level design department once you got used to its gameplay style, thus making it the overall better game in my eyes, its greater emphasis on speed could lead to more frequent blindsides, and thus a rougher time for the unsuspecting newcomer. Sonic 3, by contrast, paves over the difficulty balancing from the last few entries, making it an overall smoother experience, even for new players. While I still did have some trouble my first time around the block in this game, these features made it a much more forgiving experience that was easier to get into. For one, the visibility has been marginally improved. Sonic's sprite was changed to an all-new one, and it's slightly smaller than the one in Sonic 1, 2, and CD. This makes it a bit easier to react to hazards that come up. Additionally, the hazard placement seems a lot less trollish this time around, and there aren't nearly as many instances of poorly placed obstacles that get in the way. Now, granted, it's not completely 100% perfect in this regard, and sometimes the devs got lazy in this respect. Zones such as Marble Garden and Carnival Night can still surprise motherfucker you with occasional off-screen hazards, but outside of that, I find the screen crunch to be far less prevalent in Sonic 3, and any instances I may find are usually just momentary slip-ups. Once again though, fan works come to save the day. Unfortunately, Sonic 3 never got an official Retro Engine port by the Taxman and Stealth, all because of weird licensing nonsense related to its soundtrack. Instead, the fans took it upon themselves to create the definitive way to play. Years ago, that option was Sonic 3 Complete, a ROM hack of the game based off the aforementioned cancelled Sonic 3 Limited Edition. It combines the two games into one ROM and offers a whole host of options, including mechanics changes and allowing you to choose Sonic's sprite. Setting this version up also involves patching a ROM, so it's not the most accessible way to play, and not to mention it needs to be emulated. That's where Sonic 3 Angel Island Revisited, or Sonic 3 Air for short, released in 2019 and developed by Eukaryote, sorry if I mispronounced that, comes in. I remember being all ready to call 3 Complete the definitive version, but then Air barges in and takes the throne away. Sure, it's missing some features from 3 Complete, but what it adds more than makes up for it. Most notably, the game is now rendered in 16:9 widescreen, complete with the option for sharp pixels. These things make this game look nicer than it ever has, and it totally eliminates any of those rare issues with the visibility. Well, 99% of the time anyway. In addition, it has an achievement system, an option for remastered music, as well as which track you'd like to hear. More on that in a bit, and above all else, it's super easy to install. Just download it, locate the ROM, and you're golden. Without a doubt, if you want to play Sonic 3 these days, which you definitely should do, this is the way to go. Sega did delist Sonic 3 and K from Steam, but if you have a ROM file with a .md extension, it should still work. As with the other fan projects, I'm impressed with the work that was done here. Kudos to the fan devs, you guys are doing God's work in providing a faithful version of these games on a fundamental level, except with a few modern enhancements like a higher resolution. Anyways, let's get back on track, shall we? On top of everything I've just mentioned, this game also adds a save feature, and generally has more chances to earn lives and continues throughout the game. Two fundamental improvements to the Sonic formula. I'll admit, I'm a bit hesitant to say that Sonic 3 should get the credit for adding a save system, because Sonic CD also had one, but still, it's the first Sonic game released natively for the Genesis to feature it, and that deserves props. It is a bit strange, as it only saves the zone you're on rather than the particular act, so you will have to restart the zone from the beginning if you get a game over. The standalone Sonic the Hedgehog 3 cartridge is also the only one to have a save battery in it, so playing Sonic and Knuckles by itself functions exactly like the previous games, limited continues and all. A pretty compelling reason to play the combined game rather than the two halves separately. Despite these things, I'd say the fact that the game saves your progress at all is better than not doing so, and I love how it does it with an autosave at the start of each new zone you reach. Your lives continues and even Chaos Emeralds are also saved, so there's no need to worry if you have to put the game down and come back later. Just make sure to do so when you're on the first act of each zone is all. But wait a second, why are there still continues in this game when it has a save feature? Well, instead of acting as extra coins in an arcade cabinet that prevent you from having to restart the entire game, it lets you continue from the specific act you're on. Personally, I would have preferred a save feature that saves the specific level you made it to, but again, this is workable. That said, I doubt most will have trouble with having to restart zones anyway, due to how many chances the game gives you to earn continues and, for that matter, extra lives, like I said a second ago. It's all because of one simple addition, that being the bonus stages. Now, I don't mean the Chaos Emerald special stages. Sonic 3 actually adds a few exclusive bonus levels that exist for the sole purpose of earning rings, lives, and continues. These minigames are accessed the exact same way as the Sonic 2 special stages. Just hit a checkpoint with enough rings, which in this game is at least 20 rather than 50, and jump into the hoop of stars that appears to access the stage. Very simple, and it gives you plenty of chances to play the stages, which I like. Depending on how many rings you hit the checkpoint with, you'll get one of 3 stages. If you have between 20 and 34, it's a slot machine. 35 and 49 will be the glow ball stage, and 50 or more, you'll be sent to a gumball machine level. And then after a certain point, it just starts to loop, but that's the baseline. The slot machine features the slots from Casino Night Zone in a small area that functions exactly like the Sonic 1 special stages, where the stage constantly spins, has special tiles that reverse its direction or change its rotation speed, and where touching a sphere that says goal ejects you from the stage. If you collect 50 rings while on this stage, you'll earn a continue, indicated by the typical sound effect. The gumball machine is, well, a gumball machine. Only hard-hitting commentary allowed on this channel. Its walls have those bouncy yellow pads from Metropolis Zone, and spinning the crank in the machine's center drops an item, potentially an extra life or shield. Glow Ball is probably my favorite one though. It's this really neat vertical platforming area where you have to ascend a shaft full of electrified spheres. Sonic spins around on them, and jumping between them requires timing a jump properly to fling yourself upwards. In between each sphere are small orbs that spawn items when touched, potentially including a 1-up, or a heap of rings that acts like one, should you reach the top of the stage. All the while, a beam of electricity chases you from below, forcing you to act quickly. I used to find this bonus minigame really confusing, but after figuring it out, I find it really fun, definitely the most enjoyable of all three. Unfortunately, you can't earn continues in any stage but the slot machine, which is my least favorite of the three, but the extra lives still make the others more than worth playing. Also, there's one more method of earning continues, and that is, again, the special stages. I'm just gonna say it, I think this game has the best special stage system in the franchise. Not only is the method of accessing them far less tedious, but I find the stages themselves are actually designed competently. In the previous games, you had to bring 50 rings to some point in the stage, whether it was at the end of the level or a checkpoint, to access them. This was often really annoying to do in my opinion, since the visibility issues could cause you to lose the rings right before reaching the checkpoint or stage ending. Then there was the issue of the stages themselves, which I found fairly unfun in all the previous games. I've never once gotten all the Chaos Emeralds or Time Stones in any of them because I could never be bothered. In Sonic 3, by contrast, I actually think the special stages are fairly solid, and because of this, I consistently get all 7 emeralds. Even when I'm not trying to, I'm just going for continues, I usually end up getting them. To start, accessing the stage is way more logical. Instead of bringing an arbitrary number of rings to some point in the stage, you'll instead find the large rings from Sonic 1 hidden in various set places throughout each level, which you can jump into to access the special stage. This makes them function far more similarly to the bonus barrels from the SNES Donkey Kong Country games, providing an incentive to explore the levels. Once inside the stages, you'll notice that they're far more playable now too. Gone are the days of poor controls, collision, and visibility. These special stages are ones I can actually enjoy. You're tasked with gathering a bunch of blue spheres while avoiding the red ones. Touching a blue sphere turns it into a red one, and if you do hit one that's red, you're kicked out of the stage. Thankfully, any large cluster of blues can all be eliminated at once by collecting all the perimeter spheres, which transforms the cluster into a bunch of rings. Collecting 50 rings grants you a continue, while getting all of them in a particular stage gives you a perfect bonus and usually an extra life upon stage completion. The only things I dislike about these stages is how they start to speed you up after a while, which could throw you off if it happens at the wrong time, and how Sonic's turning can be a tiny bit stiff. Other than those things, I find these fairly enjoyable. They aren't easy and may take a number of tries, but because tracking them down is really painless, as simple as finding a special ring, I really don't mind. As always, getting all the blue spheres in a stage grants you a Chaos Emerald, and when you get all 7, you get to be Supersonic. In this game, it's something I'm actually able to do, and consistently at that. Supersonic is kind of awesome. You're invincible, you can run even faster than normal, and you can beat the shit out of bosses by doing pretty much nothing. Just get 50 rings and press a button after jumping, and the form activates. In the original game, this is a bit annoying because you can accidentally engage Supersonic when you want to do an insta-shield in a case of same button syndrome, but thankfully Sonic 3 Air remaps this to the B button on the Xbox controller. It even lets you press the button again to cancel the form, so you aren't locked into using it if you do so on accident. Oh, and need I remind you, once you unlock Supersonic, he's on your save file forever, so you can use him all you'd like after doing so. Hell, you can even pick Angel Island Zone from the stage select upon beating the game and play the entire thing with the form if you want. The first ever NG Plus mode in the Sonic series. Now that's pretty cool. Oh yeah, and when you reach Mushroom Hill Zone, you can even trade the 7 emeralds for a new set of much harder special stages, which grants you another set of gemstones called the Super Emeralds. Getting all these unlocks Hypersonic, an even stronger form. I've never been able to do this personally. The Sonic and Knuckles Blue Sphere stages can get pretty devious, but maybe I'll do it someday, because Hypersonic looks fucking insane to play around with. In all versions, these forms unfortunately block out the music too, which is a shame, because it's really awesome. But what can you do? And like I said, you can at least cancel the super hard forms in Air. Which reminds me, the soundtrack in this game is, how do I say this? absolutely fucking awesome. Sonic music basically always is, and has been since the series' inception, something I've made no secret of in these videos. That said, I think Sonic 3 has by far the series' strongest showing yet. This absolute masterpiece of a soundtrack had numerous contributors, including Brad Buxer from the band The Jetsons, Howard Drawson, known for composing numerous soundtracks for movies and games, including Sonic Spinball and Comic Zone, and of course, Michael Jackson himself. Speaking of that, it was always a debate whether Michael worked on this game, since he goes uncredited. That was because of the, things he was getting into at the time, let's just say, which caused Sega to kick him out of the project. Then all of a sudden, Yuji Naka took a break from committing insider trading to nonchalantly confirm that Jackson did indeed contribute to tracks to Sonic 3, even showing a helicopter photo of his house. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing. Anyways, this game also features the debut of rock musician Jun Sonoe in the series. He contributed a few tracks and jingles to the game, most notably the Stage Clear theme. Make sure to keep him in mind for future videos in this retrospective. His work will become very important to the series. All of these people's skills came together extremely well and produced a soundtrack that's so damn good. I find it hard to properly describe in words. Simply put, it's an absolute banger that I never get tired of listening to. What helps it is the complete absence of all Genesis twang. Sonic 3's OST is high quality and organic sounding, and yet it still has that raw FM synthesis sound that really shines when the Genesis sound chip is used just right. Not only that, I find the compositions to be the most memorable and catchy in the series yet. There's far too many badass tracks to list here. They're all just such bangers, fit the feel of the respective stage they play in, and some like Lava Rave Act 2 even include some genuine atmosphere, which is really impressive for the Genesis's Yamaha sound chip. And yes, I did specify Act 2, because more impressive still, every individual level features its own track. Sure, many of the Act 2s are just slight remixes of the Act 1s, being the same song with a slightly different arrangement, but it still increases the soundtrack's variety, and many tracks are different enough to sound distinct. If I had to pick favorites, they would include Marble Garden Act 2, Ice Cap Act 1, Flying Battery Act 2, and Lava Reef Act 1. Special mention definitely goes to Hydro City Act 2, which is one of the songs that immediately comes to mind when I think of this game. It's this absolute throbbing banger that features a killer bassline that complements a badass melody. It goes up and down and all around, much like the stage's layout itself. It also features some subtle reverb that emphasizes the expansive space Sonic is traveling through. An absolute feast for the ears. Like with the other games, I could absolutely sit here and dissect every single track in detail, but I just don't have the time for that. So here, as I usually do, have a sampling of some of my favorite tracks in the entire game. Yeah, that was a lot of tracks I just showed off there, but can you blame me? You heard how good they were. I've been using this music frequently in videos for years, even as far back as 2018, and I think you can see why. This is an all-star soundtrack that I love, which by the way, I should also mention there are a bunch of alternate tracks that also exist. If you play the first half of the game by itself, some tracks such as the mini-boss theme are different. Honestly, I prefer the Sonic and Knuckles tracks that play when the two games are locked together as one, although the exclusive credits theme is badass. However, I'm more so referring to the prototype songs. Remember how I said Michael Jackson composed for this game but then got kicked out? Well, Sega still ended up using his music, which was apparently illegal for them to do. Ever wonder why they just sort of stopped re-releasing this game after around 2011 or so? That's because they found out they had technically been infringing copyright by using the music without a license, and so decided to stop re-releasing it to prevent potential legal troubles. That is until 2022 with the release of the Sonic Origins collection, in which Sonic 3 had numerous tracks replaced by completely different songs. These were originally included in the 1997 PC port of the game called Sonic and Knuckles Collection, which... Wait a minute, no they weren't. Well, yes, these tracks were in that version, but it's not where they originated. In 2019, which was a big year for this game now that I think about it, holy hell, the first and currently only prototype we know to exist for Sonic 3 was discovered. It's weird, having some really strange bugs and even featuring Sonic's old sprite, but what's interesting is that the songs match the Sonic and Knuckles collection tracks, meaning they were originally going to be in the game instead of what we got. Personally, while you can surely tell they're unfinished prototype songs, I think many still have some decent composition. I especially like Carnival Night and Launch Base Act 2, and may even slightly prefer the former over the final version's track. Blasphemy, I know, but that's how it is for me. Alright, enough about the music, I think you get it already. How about the visuals? Well, my thoughts on that particular aspect are quite simple. I think this is one of the best looking Genesis games, full stop. At the very least, it's the best looking Sonic game released for the system. The environments and sprite work have seen an absolute glow up from the previous games. Not to say that those games looked bad, but in comparison to Sonic 3, they almost look rudimentary. Sonic 3 just has so much more detail, and in general, I think its environments appear much more organic and colorful than those games. This game's color palette is extremely vibrant and broad. The backgrounds have all sorts of detail unseen in any previous entry, and the art direction is just generally awesome to look at and captivates the mind. There's also the occasional bit of environmental storytelling, like how you can see these weird contraptions as well as the Death Egg in Lava Reef Act 2. Yes, environmental storytelling. In a damn Genesis game. How cool is that? Not to mention, the level settings are also quite varied, and whereas some stages do feature tropey level themes seen in every other platformer ever, such as a desert, icy mountain, and a volcano, I'd say they looked original enough to keep them interesting to stare at the whole game. Levels like Flying Battery also defy tropes altogether, producing a really unique aesthetic that's distinctly Sonic the Hedgehog. Oh yeah, and this may come off as nitpicky, but it's still something I wholeheartedly believe. I think Sonic's new sprite is way better than the one from Sonic 1, 2, and CD, alright? Not just because it's slightly smaller and gives you a bit more reaction time, but I also think he just looks way cooler, more sleek, and a lot less pudgy, which I find fitting for such a blazing fast character. Also, the boss sprites are really awesome looking, because they're usually really big, detailed, creatively designed, and show off some solid animation. And I enjoy these moments of scripted flair, which add to the thrill of the stage in the moment while not being intrusive. This game is a visual marvel for the Genesis, and in my opinion, one of its most gorgeous games. Which, by the way, speaking of those levels, should probably at least bring them up at some capacity. I've always extolled the value of level design in a platforming game, because it's a playground to use the mechanics given to you. I've praised the series' level design up to this point, with maybe the slight exception of Sonic CD, which I found was a mix of being overcomplicated for the sake of it, and really shallow if you avoid the tedious side quests, creating a dilemma where the game was kind of unsatisfying to me either way. By contrast, Sonic 3 features what I would call the best stage design in the classic Sonic era. These stages are exceptionally nuanced and polished, and I consider them the most refined, enjoyable, replayable, and overall best stages in the series thus far. I really have almost no complaints to speak of, they're just so well crafted. Every last square micrometer feels absolutely deliberate, with none of the haphazardly placed nonsense that Sonic CD frequently had. As I went into earlier, I also find that they contain the least amount of noob traps and dickish enemy placement, which makes them the most fun to come back to for me. One of the challenges with Sonic's gameplay has always been balancing speed and platforming. Without the proper care put into balance things, it's easy for this sort of thing to go completely wrong, creating an experience that's difficult to control and potentially hard to enjoy as a result. I have a hunch that this is why this series is so polarizing and why so many people find it difficult to find enjoyment in, whereas others are beyond dedicated and love it unconditionally. So far, I'd say the series has thankfully succeeded in this respect, but not without some hiccups along the way, as I've been going into. Different games in the series often handle this in their own unique ways. Sonic 1, for instance, included a special speed cap that gave Sonic a top speed he couldn't go over. Sonic 2, by contrast, OS removed this, which made it overall faster and more satisfying, but also harder to learn how to play. Sonic 3 sort of takes an approach that's the best of both worlds, and segregates stages into two types of areas: speed zones and platforming zones. Personally, I think this was a smart choice. It makes it so new players have the opportunity to go fast, but also so they aren't constantly thrusted into unpredictable hazards due to low visibility, giving them a taste of Sonic speed even if they suck at the game. I've heard some people argue that this design philosophy is inferior to Sonic 2's more combined approach, but I'm very much okay with it in concept, because I don't find the separation of elements that comes at the cost of the skill ceiling. If you're good enough at the game, you can absolutely blast through the game's more open areas via an effective use of Sonic's moveset, as well as the elemental shields if you have one. I find that this is the universal appeal of Sonic as a franchise, being able to turn relatively methodical sections that may take newcomers a second to complete into an absolute joke with Sonic's incredible speeds, taking shortcuts and finding the best routes to beat stages in record times. Granted, there are still segments you might have to wait through, such as these elevators and Flying Battery Zone Act 2. I also don't care much for Sandopolis Act 2, because it has annoying ghosts and generally slow-paced gimmicks, but the Rising Sand set piece is a cool idea if you ask me, so that's neat. My least favorite zone is probably Carnival Night though, because of all these bouncy set pieces that ping-pong you all over the place. I find that these things are few and far between in this game, and it's not like previous entries didn't have these pace-breaking elements every now and then, especially Sonic 1. For the majority of this game's runtime, the pace is dictated by the player, and it's endlessly satisfying to speed through these levels and beat them as quickly as you can, pulling off some sick shit while you're at it. This game takes the cake for the series' most interesting set pieces, if you ask me at least. I can name numerous examples throughout. Hydrocity Zone is like Labyrinth, except if it was fun, managing to include underwater sections in a non-intrusive way. It's also sick as hell when you get to run across the water's surface, which looks fucking awesome. Ice Cap Zone includes clever icy set pieces and neat puzzles, while managing to resist including annoying ice physics that make it a pain to play. It also opens with the first ever snowboarding sequence in the series, and features some of the best moments of physics manipulation for you to play around with. The second half of the game has this stuff in abundance as well, namely with Flying Battery Zone's blazing fast mechanical swings, and Lava Reef's treacherous magma pits, lava falls, and gigantic rolling boulders. Lava Reef's second act also mixes it up, and features a lot of careful navigation between dangerous crushers and tight caverns, complete with an interesting frozen appearance that I really like. I don't really know what else to say about this. Each stage has an identifiable set piece that helps them all stand out from one another, which often applies to the individual acts too. I mean, ask me to point out unique set pieces in every individual level in the previous games, and I probably couldn't do it, but here in Sonic 3 I can. In other words, this game is always doing something new, and as a result it never gets old for me. Additionally, I think exploration is also the best it's been in the series yet. It's something I've been praising in this series thus far. Sonic's levels have always had a healthy amount of hidden item boxes and branching routes for you to look for, which added a lot of extra spice to the gameplay. That being said, it wasn't the entire focus, and was instead the cherry on top of a tasty platforming sundae. Sonic 3 understands this quite well, and while its levels have more complex paths and general layouts per capita than Sonic 1 and 2, I've always found them easily navigable even on my first playthrough. This is no Sonic CD situation, where I thought the levels could often come off as a disorganized clusterfuck. In general, the exploratory elements are just a nice bonus to the solid momentum-based platforming set pieces, giving the levels a bit of extra life, and the game doesn't attempt to make them the primary focus, a direction I much prefer for Sonic over what CD was attempting to do. That being said, there's still a satisfactory amount of hidden goodies to find, even more than previous games if you ask me. I brought up the revamped special stage system, but if that wasn't enough, there's once again a whole bunch of hidden item boxes just waiting to be discovered by observant players. As early as a few seconds into Angel Island Act 1, you can hit this hidden spring to bounce up to the top of a tree, on which there's another that reveals monitors with some rings and power sneakers that were hiding just above your view from the ground. In Carnival Night Act 2, if you can bounce onto this one ledge with these spinning bumpers, you'll find a bubble shield that makes the following water section much easier. Hell, in Launch Base Act 1, there was also this one instance where I was walking around the bottom path after falling down there by accident, and I managed to find a hidden alcove with a thunder shield in it that I didn't even know existed. Sometimes when I play this game, I end up finding something totally new, and trust me, I've played it countless times. It's just great. I find this game endlessly replayable, and it's all because it mixes speed, platforming, and exploration in such a cohesive and polished way, all the while promoting skill mastery through said replayability. For me, that's what Sonic is all about, and Sonic 3 is one of the best in this regard in my eyes. And that's not all. Everything I just said was written with the Sonic campaign in mind. He's not the only playable character though. When beginning a new file, you also have the choice to play as Tails or Knuckles. This technically wasn't the first Sonic game to feature more playable characters, as Sonic 2 lets you play as Tails, but he was just a Sonic clone in that game, so it was pretty much an aesthetic preference. Here, each character's inclusion is justified with unique abilities. Tails can fly, whereas Knuckles can glide, climb walls, and break certain bits of stage geometry, which allows both characters to reach unique paths or find items that are inaccessible as Sonic. Honestly, I've never really cared enough to play the entire game as either of them, mostly because I find Sonic's moveset more fun to use and master, but I can appreciate the meaningful extra content. Although speaking of extra content, the Sonic and Knuckles cartridge's very nature allows for that. It was mainly originally intended to be used together with the standalone Sonic 3 cart to load the entire game, but locking on other cartridges unlocks some pretty neat secrets. If you put any random Genesis game on there, you'll get this screen that says "No way," with the character staring at you. Same thing goes for Sonic 1. However, if you press all 3 buttons on this screen, you'll get to play Blue Sphere, a gamified version of the special stages from the main game. The game gives you a random stage if you connect any given Genesis cartridge, but it unlocks all of the 134 million possible stages if you lock on Sonic 1. What the fuck? However, Sonic 2 is unique. Putting it onto Sonic and Knuckles will unlock a whole new campaign, Knuckles and Sonic 2. As its name implies, it lets you play as Knuckles in Sonic 2. How cool is that? It sort of reminds me of those perks the Ratchet and Clank games had for playing the games in order. An extra bonus for those who own the other games in the series. Again, I'd personally rather play Sonic 2 normally whenever I decide to do so, but I appreciate the addition because God, it's just so cool how they managed to pull this off. And as an aspiring programmer, it's just really neat to see, you know? Man, I've been talking about this game way longer than the others, and that's because I just love it that much. It's my favorite Genesis Sonic game, so I knew this video wasn't going to turn out any other way. I think it's the best the series has been, at least from the games I've covered in this retrospective as of now. Let me tell you, that also applies to the climax, which is no doubt in my mind the most awesome finale in this series so far. It goes all out and manages to cap off this era of the franchise perfectly. It's such an excellent rising of tension that culminates in an intense battle between Sonic and Eggman that feels really grandiose in the best way possible. It all starts in Lava Reef Act 2, where you see the Death Egg trapped in the volcano's caldera. Knuckles once again gets in Sonic's way, and sends him and Tails tumbling into the pit below with a giant boulder. When they fall down there, the ship's eyes flash with a blinding light, which melts the frozen zone, returning it to its molten state from before. Following this is a really exciting boss fight against the Doctor, who tries his best to eliminate the heroes with missiles. Meanwhile, you'll have to complete some of the most tense platforming, as it involves a quick auto-scroller above a bottomless pit. Once you're through that, Eggman will use his machine to tilt the molten lava below you, launching spiked balls in an attempt to take Sonic out. This part requires some really precise jumps to successfully avoid damage, and is made all the more challenging by the magma floor. It's probably the best boss yet, since it actually requires being careful and can't be brute forced in any way. Once this is done with, Sonic arrives in Hidden Palace Zone, a single act level that borrows its name from the infamous cut stage from Sonic 2. This level is pretty short and easy, more or less serving as a story moment than anything. Sonic engages Knuckles in a fight that I somehow managed to die twice on. Feel free to make fun of me in the comments, but I swear they make it a little more challenging in Sonic 3 Air, because in the original you could attack Knuckles as he was gliding. In Sonic 3 Air you can't do that though, as far as I can tell. So you know what, props to the Air developers for doing that. Anywho, in the background there's this really cool looking mural that shows a super powerful being fighting some sort of god. Make sure to keep that in mind because it's foreshadowing to something that's about to transpire. After Knuckles is defeated, the characters run to the shrine to their right, and it's here where Eggman officially reveals his true intentions to Knuckles. The Doctor steals the Master Emerald, which Knuckles protests. He tries getting it back, but Eggman shocks him with his Eggmobile, fleeing to the Death Egg and powering it back up with the huge gemstone. All seems lost, especially when the animal trio falls down to another room when the floor collapses. Knuckles gets back up and, having been betrayed by Eggman, realizes that Sonic and Tails were never the bad guys to begin with. In a change of heart, he opens up to the two heroes, and with them having proven themselves capable throughout this entire adventure, he leads them to a special teleporter so we can get on our way after the villainous Doctor. Yeah, that's right. Character progression in a 16-bit video game. Would you check that out? Sure, it's simple, but it's a moment I'll always remember. Throughout this entire game, Knuckles has been a huge pain in the arse to Sonic, constantly interrupting his progress and not understanding that Eggman is not his friend. It's when the Doctor betrays him that he realizes the error of his ways, and thus teams up with Sonic and Tails to help them save the island and prevent Eggman from conquering the world. I have to commend the team for this, since you really don't see this sort of thing in games back then, and it really speaks to how impactful Sonic was. He was doing things that other platformers wouldn't even attempt for a few more years, and on hardware that can only display up to 61 colors on screen at once. Anyway, after that, we reach Sky Sanctuary Zone, one of the coolest looking levels in the game. It's a temple set high in the sky, touching the clouds and featuring floating pillars and ancient buildings. Near the start, you can see the Death Egg rising from below, getting ready to take off into space, which is a really cool set piece. The level itself is also neat, featuring some solid platforming, satisfying speed segments, a neat looking new enemy called the Egg Robo, and it even sees you fighting throwback bosses to the previous games, specifically to the Green Hill boss from Sonic 1 and the Metropolis boss from Sonic 2. It makes you reflect on how far the series has come since then. These are piloted by Eggman's latest incarnation of robotic Sonic, Mecha Sonic. Honestly, I think this guy looks way cooler than Metal Sonic from CD, and it's probably my favorite version of this particular trope. You even fight him in a unique boss at the end of the stage, which is easy, but features decent animations. Oh yeah, and the best part of the level? Why, it's only the revolutionary AI they've programmed for Knuckles here. If you crouch while standing on a specific spot, he'll gesture for Sonic to get a damn move on already. Amazing, isn't it? Special thanks to the Sonic lore master himself, Cybershell, for that piece of information, by the way. I genuinely didn't know about this little Easter egg before watching his video on it. Regardless, after beating Mecha Sonic at the end of the stage, the following then occurs. that's just awesome. Not really much more to say than that. Oh boy, we're really closing in now. We're now in Death Egg Zone, which is actually a fully fleshed out level this time around. It's also just as solid as the rest of the game. Yep, even this far in, Sonic 3 is still going strong. It's much longer than the previous games, stretching out across 13 entire zones, and yet it never runs out of steam. This zone features plenty of satisfying exploration, with hidden items galore to find, as well as challenging platforming with Eggman's bizarre technology and really neat light bridges that are a visual spectacle. The first act concludes with the infamous Red Eye, a pretty tough boss fight that can easily hand your ass to you on a silver platter. I had a tough time on my first playthrough, but with repeated ones, I eventually got the hang of it. With Super Sonic though, he's an absolute joke, which I find really funny, although you deserve it if you put in the work to unlock him. Once he's down, the wall behind you collapses, revealing a view of the planet, which may just be my favorite background in the game. What can I say? I love space. Act 2 is notably longer and more challenging than Act 1, and has numerous tough segments that will push your skills with Sonic's moveset to the absolute max. Fitting, since for most players it will be the final stage. It also has a neat set piece in the form of gravity, which wouldn't be the last time the series would make use of such a set piece. It thankfully doesn't flip your controls when you're upside down, which I appreciate, because that just would have been a real dumb way to raise the difficulty for no reason. As a result, while this level can get quite tough, I also find it more than fair, and it features some decently placed hidden items of its own. But man, let me tell you, as soon as you reach the end of this stage, that's where the real fun begins. These next several minutes are some of the most pulse-pounding kino in the entire series. It's, for lack of a better term, epic. Where do I even begin? Well, it all starts with an unorthodox fight against the Death Ball. I say it's unorthodox because it has bounce pads on it, which cause Sonic to rebound if you try to hit it as normal, so you have to find another way to damage it. Rather than fighting the boss directly, it drops weird spiked drones. To damage the thing, you'll have to use the gravity mechanics to your advantage to orient the spikes properly, and then drop them onto the ball. You'll have to be careful though, since the drones eject their spikes when they burst, which can be fairly tricky to avoid in the cramped space of the room you're fighting the boss in. This boss isn't particularly hard, but it just takes some effort to line the things up correctly and avoid damage. While you do it, Eggman's sitting there on the right, laughing at Sonic and Tails for the entire time they fight the ball. That's funny, and what seals the deal is, once again, when you beat the boss. Eggman gets this really hilarious shocked expression on his face and runs away like the coward he is. Again, somehow being able to outrun Sonic despite his speed. See what I mean? The Doctor is absolutely the fastest thing alive, not Sonic. I'll publish my PhD thesis on this by next week, thank you. Another funny detail, which is definitely unintended but one that still makes me laugh, is how Sonic will continue to push against nothing if you continuously hold right after the wall collapses. I don't know, it just makes me giggle a little bit when I see it. As I've said in my videos before, my sense of humor is beyond deceased. So yeah, that's the Death Ball. Now let's talk about the real star of the show. Sonic and Eggman run on a wide open section of the Death Egg, presumably some sort of docking bay, and the Doctor initiates his final backup plan. He enters this odd semicircular device and... Oh dear lord, now things have gotten serious. Welcome to the final boss of Sonic 3 and Knuckles. I think this fight is quite often criminally overlooked, which is unfortunate because goodness gracious is this one of the most awesome boss fights in gaming history. If it's not my favorite final boss ever, it's certainly right up there. It's against the largest Eggman mech we've ever seen. The thing is so large that only the top half of its body is visible at any given moment, and it makes a huge tremor whenever it takes a step. This is the great Eggman Robo, and whenever I think of Dr. Eggman's technical feats, it's one of the first things that comes to mind. I mean, just look at it. Look at how awesome that design is. It's intimidating and makes you feel tiny by comparison. So how about we take it out? This boss is challenging, and it also manages to be consistently exciting because its pace is kept at a steady clip, in contrast to the Death Egg robot, which I thought was really slow and tiring. The first phase is relatively simple. Eggman will try to crush you with the robot's large fingers. These can be taken out with some simple spin dashing, with each individual finger being able to withstand 3 hits before exploding. It's the second phase where the real challenge lies. The mech will move over to the left side of the screen, and begin walking towards you while destroying the runway as it does. As this happens, the mech also shoots out a fire attack that must be jumped over. You'll have to land a hit on its nose, which will open its mouth, revealing a gigantic fucking laser beam powered by the Master Emerald. When it's open, that's your chance to attack, but you have to do so quickly, because as soon as it opens up, the beam starts charging. To dodge it, you'll have to jump with precise timing right before it goes off, as the beam is large enough to hit you if you're not already at the peak of your jump arc when it fires. It may sound really difficult, but with practice, you'll get used to it. My only problem is that Tails can potentially get you killed, as just like in Sonic 2, he tries to land hits on the boss for you. This can be helpful, but if he does so after you've already jumped towards the mech, you can potentially fall through its iframes and into the bottomless pit on the left. So if you're playing with Tails, that's something else to be careful about. Also, the fight doesn't give you rings, much like the previous games, so if you lose the ones you had from Act 2, you don't get any more of them. All things considered though, this is probably my favorite part of the boss, because I like how challenging and intense it is. It gets my adrenaline pumping. Also, I find it to be perfectly doable without rings, since the attacks are clearly telegraphed and give you more than enough time to avoid them. But you know what really sells the feeling of excitement in this boss? The absolutely all-star music track. This may just be my favorite track in the game, it's just perfect. Whereas other Sonic final boss themes seem to create an atmosphere of a tense struggle between the two enemies, this one goes more in the direction of intensity and action. Almost like it's the theme for a desperate fight to determine the fate of all living beings or something. Oh wait, that's literally what it is. Huh, neat. It's the exclamation point to not only the grand adventure we've gone on throughout the game, but also the entire series up to this point. Mix that with the planet in the background and the sheer enormity of the mech, and you've got a recipe for a stunning finale that keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time. The instrumentation in this song is top-notch, featuring a strong synth lead, a powerful bass line, and hard-hitting percussion. It starts off all ominous, with a slow section emphasizing the mech's grand entrance. Once the thing comes over and fills the entire screen though, the song's main melody kicks in, which is an absolute banger with a quick tempo and exciting feel, as I said. Gives you the sense that Eggman is going all out for this one. He's been defeated over and over by this blue hedgehog and he's had enough. It's an all-out war between the two, and for both, it's either kill or be killed. However, since it's Sonic we're talking about, he eventually manages to destroy the mech and it goes up in flames. The explosion is so spectacular in fact that it causes the death egg to begin collapsing. It's all over for Eggman, he has nowhere left to go. Except wait, he managed to survive the mech's destruction and is now carrying the Master Emerald away with it. The Doctor really does not want Sonic to get that emerald. Debris begins to fall in from the top of the screen, and the ground beneath Sonic begins to collapse. In this last phase, you have to land 8 final hits on the Doctor's Eggmobile, being careful not to fall into the mess of collapsing ground behind you. It's here where things go off the rails in the story, and it becomes clear that the situation on the Death Egg is critically beyond repair. It makes this phase the most chaotic of them all. And what really sells it is something that was definitely unintentional, but I still think adds to the game regardless. And unfortunately is something Sonic 3 Air can't replicate. Due to limitations in the Genesis' sound hardware, the rumbling sound causes one of the song's sound channels to cut out, essentially leaving the lead instrument as the only one playing. I think this makes the song sound really epic for this phase. It produces this neat effect where the main melody has more emphasis placed on it, making the song sound more airy, I suppose. It gives this vibe that this is the tipping point, from which Eggman's plan has finally been foiled, and he has no choice but to flee like a coward. Maybe I'm overanalyzing a hardware limitation, but I don't care. I've always thought it sounded really cool, irrespective of whether it was intentional or not. One more thing to note about this phase though, be sure to land the last hit on the right side of the Eggmobile, because if you don't, Sonic could potentially be rebounded and fall into the pit and die. That's happened to me before, and even though I love this boss, nobody wants to start it over because of something like that. Regardless, once you land the last hit, Eggman seemingly drops the Master Emerald and flees the scene as the Death Egg explodes into a bright flash of white light. My god, what a fucking climax. I can't even begin to describe how excellently that was built up. Throughout this grand journey, you fought Eggman repeatedly, attempting to foil his schemes, but he's always been one step ahead of you, especially due to the help of Knuckles. Now, after showing his true intentions, Knuckles is the reason for his ultimate downfall, having sent Sonic on his way to stop the Doctor in his tracks. Once you finally get up there and confront him, you get this unforgettable finale sequence where you manage to single-handedly take down the most gigantic mech the Doctor has ever used, which by the way was powered by a large miracle gem with incomprehensible power. And to top it all off, you get one of the most intense final boss themes in history, which truly tells how crucial it is for Sonic to eliminate this evil Doctor once and for all, lest the entire world pay for his failure. It's amazing stuff, and the kind of thing that makes this game, nay, the series as a whole, so memorable. I couldn't think of a more perfect note to end this game on, and if this was the last Sonic game, it would have made for an extremely satisfying finale. Now, I'm glad this series didn't end, because there's a certain later game with a climax that may just top this one. Not saying anything definitive right now, but as of this moment in the retrospective, this final boss is the peak of Sonic climaxes. Absolute fucking Kino is what it is. And guess what? We're still not quite done. Yeah, there's a little more. Now, the rest doesn't quite stack up to the glorious ending I just spent however long describing in terms of pure scope, but it's solid on its own. In most cases, once you beat the final boss and watch the Death Egg collapse, the game proceeds to the ending. But if you have the full set of either emeralds, there's one more thing waiting for you afterwards. It's another level by the name of Doomsday Zone. Yes, that's right. This game has a secret final stage in it that's unlocked by getting all the emeralds. Now, there's another way to motivate a player to go for full completion. Even if this level didn't exist, I'd still think the Chaos Emerald quest was the best thing that's been in this game. But the fact that it does really seals the deal. It makes Sonic 3 feel way less like an arcade game that's relatively light, like the first couple Sonic games did, and more like like a home console optimized experience with a substantial amount of bonus content to keep you playing, much like Super Mario World or the Donkey Kong Country games. Not to say Sonic 1 and 2 weren't substantial experiences themselves, but in comparison to this game, they almost feel bare bones. Also, like with other things, make sure you keep this theme of bonus content in mind. It will become yet another theme going forward. In any event, Doomsday Zone serves as the true final battle of the game. Even though it looks like we got the Master Emerald at the end of the mech boss, the Doctor managed to swipe it in the chaos and started running away in this final escape ship. He's getting more and more desperate, and is basically doing everything he can to get away from Sonic. Well, we have the Chaos Emeralds, so Sonic's not going to take this sitting down. He goes super and gives chase to the Maniacal Doctor, thus starting the Doomsday Zone. So yes, this is also the first supersonic finale this series has ever seen. Yet another thing to add to the list of stuff to keep an eye out for moving forward. Anyways, this level opens up in an asteroid field. Sonic flies through while trying his best to avoid them, all the while Eggman fires missiles at him from his ship ahead. Hitting either of these things won't damage you, but they will slow you down a bit, and the missiles outright stun you for a brief moment. Remember, being in the super form gradually drains your rings. There's no solid ground in this level, so if you run out, you die. Therefore, you'll want to avoid getting hit as much as you can, while gathering as many scattered rings as possible. I like the idea, and though the first part is relatively easy, I can't quite say the same about the ones that follow. After a certain point, the asteroids and rings disappear as Sonic catches up with Eggman's escape ship. This phase is the most time sensitive, since there isn't a single ring placed anywhere around it. Eggman shoots heat-seeking missiles at Sonic, which the Hedgehog directs into the Doctor's ship. He didn't think about this one, did he? If you ask me, this is my favorite part of the whole fight, mostly because I think the idea is creative. Sure, it can be stressful, but as long as you're quick with it and know to mash the jump button to speed up, it shouldn't give you that much shit. Once that's over, Eggman still refuses to give up, and he's entered a rebuilt Death Egg robot. This is his last line of defense, and if he loses here, he's officially done for. This phase is as simple as ramming into the thing a few times, but since you're probably low on rings at this point, every single one of them you collect counts here. Again, using the speed up trick I mentioned, you can catch up with the Doctor and lay into him while dodging his assaults. The atmosphere here is top notch as always, especially with the zone's discordant and intense music. It sounds like we've really gone in too deep now, and like this truly is the final chapter. That's doubly true when you have 10 rings. When the music speeds up and shit, it puts a fire under your ass and makes you act as quickly as possible. And when you land the final hit on Eggman, you get to watch the robot explode in a supremely gratifying fashion. As I said, while I prefer the Great Eggman Robo fight for its sheer climactic spectacle, this is a nice bonus for those who have collected all the emeralds. And with that, Sonic 3 and Knuckles comes to a close. If you didn't play Doomsday Zone, you get the bad ending, in which Angel Island remains stranded in the sea. But if you did, Sonic and Tails bring the Master Emerald back to it, and the island rises into the sky once again. If you got Hyper Sonic, then there's also this additional shot of Knuckles before the credits, but again, I've never done that. I'm fine with the good ending though. It's perfectly satisfying enough for me. A nice conclusion to this long, well, relatively long anyway, journey. Whatever ending you get, the credits then roll with yet another absolute banger of a credits medley. And because I think this soundtrack is the best one from a Genesis Sonic game, that goes quadruple in this case. It's enough to make me reflect on all we've gone through, all the narrative highs and lows, the challenges, the triumphs, and just the sheer epic scale all packed into a couple 16-bit game cartridges, no less. It's a journey I shan't forget anytime soon. Sonic 3 is one of Sonic's best works, and was, without a doubt, the perfect note to end this era of the series off on, before it would make the jump to other platforms. This video turned out way longer than I was expecting, that's for sure. I don't know how I managed to write 14,000 words on a 2D side-scrolling platformer game, as well as produce a probably 40 to 50 minute video on one, but here we are. So what's my point in all this? Well, too long didn't watch, Sonic 3 and Knuckles is an absolute banger of a video game. In fact, I go so far as to say it's a masterpiece. In pretty much everything it does, I find it not only succeeds, but excels. Whereas I thought previous games were varying degrees of flawed yet still enjoyable, when taking the time to analyze Sonic 3 under the critical microscope, I'd say that it's near flawless, at least for me personally. Anything I could possibly take issue with is no more than a mere nitpick, and doesn't stop me from saying that this game is as good as you can ask for from an old 16-bit platformer. It broke new ground for the Sonic series, and introduced radical new elements that would become series staples going forward, and above all else, it was just really awesome. A more fleshed out story and world, beautiful graphics that push the Genesis to its limits, a full-on masterpiece of a soundtrack, excellent additions that make the gameplay as smooth as it's ever been, exceptionally polished stages, the best Chaos Emerald side quest in the series, a grand finale that ends the game off on the perfect crescendo of awesomeness, and above all else, a solid amount of replay value to keep me coming back over and over again. This is the pinnacle of 2D Sonic for me, and when asked what my favorites in the series are, it's certainly one of the games that comes to mind. That being said, as much of a high note as this game is, we're still not done here. Believe it or not, Sonic would just not stop during this era. He was going full steam ahead, and was getting ready to make the transition of a lifetime. An exciting new generation of consoles was on its way, along with revolutionary new 3D graphics. It was only a matter of time before the Hedgehog would, like many of his contemporaries, take the leap into the new dimension. At least initially though, things wouldn't go so well. Sega would yet again encounter severe development troubles, which made the prospect of a 3D Sonic game for their 5th gen system seem almost like an impossibility. Everything seemed hopelessly stacked against Sonic Team. But with the arrival of another generation after that, things would finally look up for the blue blur once again. That whole story, as well as so much more, is coming up in a few videos from now, because there's actually a few things left for me to clean up from the Genesis era. Yeah, the Genesis platformers weren't the only thing Sonic was doing around this time. There was also plenty of supplemental material, mostly on other Sega systems. I'm not interested in covering every last one of them, but as I said at the beginning of this review marathon, if the game's a platformer of some sort, I'll more than likely talk about it. So join me if you'd like, when I cover several Game Gear games, and even one game from both the Genesis and 32X. I don't know, I guess you could call them the other 90s Sonic platformers? Yeah, sure, I'll go with that. Regardless, I'm going to be playing many of those games for the first time, so tune in if you'd like to hear my newcomer's perspective on some forgotten Sonic games from long ago, I suppose. If you sat through this whole thing, thank you for watching, and even if you didn't, thanks anyway. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.
You won't get away with this, you madman! No way!